This is the first installment of the book review blog, podcast and channel on YouTube. Basically, I would want to start this series with a review of the book by Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And the book is on Xi Jinping, How Xi's Marxist Nationalism is Shaping China and the World, published last year by the Oxford University Press. I have, as part of the whole project, also a blog on the Hypothesis platform, so that there will be more links and more materials on the in the blog post on the platform, so that one can always get more of a background on the content of the book, more links to the book itself. And this video format I would like to use maybe to delve more into what this book is about, what the content of the book itself is, and essentially to offer a reflection on China, maybe on the Western points of view, such as from Australia, and how Australian point of view can be different from, say, American or Canadian or European, for that matter. And I think it is important to go into some more detail in terms of taking advantage of the format, being aware of what the format can do for the book review of this type, since a lot of the materials are available online, and then a video should be some sort of an opportunity to take the audience by hand and lead into the book itself. And I think overall, the book can be a reflection of the surprise of the Western establishment about the continuing Marxist tradition in China, and that the last 10 years, roughly overlapping with the term of service of Xi Jinping in China as the chairman of the Communist Party, is essentially the most powerful person in the country, and this is part of the reckoning. Essentially, this is part of the reckoning in the book format with what that means for the country, for China, what it means for the West. And I think that one needs to go into more fine detail into the book itself, which is very well structured in terms of trying to grasp the idea for the book, the plan, what the outline, what we can tell about the book project by Kevin Rudd as a former political person, as opposed to maybe scholars of the history of China, as opposed to maybe political scientists who could be offering their own opinion on what China is, where it is heading, etc. And I think the book does a fairly good job in outlining its premise, which is grappling with the ideology driving the governance in China. What is the outlook of Chinese leadership on the world, on its internal affairs? How does China understand Marxism, Leninism, and maybe also leftism, in other words, left-wing politics in general? I think that there have been insufficient account being given publicly about what Marxism is, what Leninism was or could be in present, and left-wing politics in the post-communist period, as it was commonly understood after the fall of the Soviet Union as an entity, as a primary champion of the communist cause internationally. And I think that after the fall of the Soviet Union, China has emerged, maybe not immediately, but in retrospect, as one of the more important countries that is still officially a communist or socialist country and is not part of the Western sphere. I think this is some of the issues that it is very difficult to grapple with in terms of the public discourse. And I think this book is part and parcel of this trend, where people who have been in the limelight a lot and who had the leisure and the privilege to reflect and read more about subjects such as China's rise or transition to capitalism, to try to settle the contradictions about being so capitalism driven or capitalist as China is, at least in some areas, and also being in some ways, in some important ways, also communist. So this conundrum is one of the more complicated ones. And then if you overlay over that Chinese nationalism, Chinese rise in assertiveness on the international stage, which comes with economic growth and its essential growing prosperity, even though China is not necessarily going to be a middle-income country anytime soon. Once again, this is a thorny subject as for whether China will ever attain high-income status, etc., given the trends, given the economic situation, and I think there is no shortage of research on that or video reviews of that. So once again, China is marked very largely by the continuities as one of the more stable entities in human history. If you think about the ancient times up to the present day. And this means that in spite of the ruptures which have been happening across the history of China, such as maybe the period of the Warring States way back in maybe early pre Common Era, right after the Common Era, and maybe after let's say at each juncture when the dynasties have been changing in Chinese imperial history, and of course the communist period and the important ruptures it is introduced in Chinese history itself. There is a continuing influence of the classical tradition on Chinese thought. Even in the contemporary times, as there has been a conscious effort to recuperate some of the legacy of the ancient Chinese intellectual traditions, such as the Confucianism, etc., and what it means for essentially a Marxist Leninist state to be coming back to some of the roots in a very selective manner, in a very self-conscious or modern way in contemporary China, and what it means for the West, or what it means for the other countries. And of course, one cannot really separate Marxism from the dialectic thought. And its reception by Mao Zedong and its reception by Xi Jinping, etc. In other words, this is something that is also likely overlooked because China continues to have Marxist Leninism departments at universities. In other words, it is still a subject that has institutes, departments, attention being spent academically on these topics, and I think the contradictions that entails in a rapidly evolving state economically, and with the adoption of the capitalist methods in China over the last 30, 40 years, etc. This is one of those things that still need extra attention. And then once again, the ideology, in other words, that brings that we may not necessarily be aware of, since a lot of the materials when China come to us from the Western point of view. In other words, sort of the media coverage comes from strictly Western point of view, whereas what is being said in Chinese, what is being said in Chinese media could be much more nuanced and also much more indebted to the ideological points of view. So that this also needs to be well accounted for, taken into account. And so that the ideological changes in China can therefore be difficult to understand, ascertain, so that one needs extra attention, extra effort to try to understand, okay, what was going on over maybe last century, over let's say Israel's half century in recent time, so that this interplay is very complex in its own right, so that it is laudable that Kevin Rudd pays attention to that while going back to Chinese history and trying to understand it as well. So that such as in terms of the impact Deng Xiaoping has had on the outlook of China, on the worldview of China, and how the primacy of the economic development in recent time has been actually reconciled with the continued support for the Marxist or Leninist ideology in China. So that this is some of the issues this book deals with, and likewise the period of Jiang Zemin, which was seen as a more progressive leader of China, especially in the West, and how he has been understanding market economics, especially as China has been joining the World Economic Forum, as China has been joining global economic frameworks, the global trade agreements, and I think that has been going hand in hand with more of a constitutional approach to governance in China, which has definitely been given a lot of confidence to the West about the future of China in general, and a possible democratization of China as part of that, which has apparently not come to pass in later years, or even right now, later decades. So once again, we should also maybe be mindful of the formulaic nature of the Chinese discourse, maybe coming with the language itself, which is very compressed, which is also steeped in history, steeped in interpretation, so that a lot of the things that get spelled out in the Western discourse may not necessarily be as explicitly understood, as explicitly spoken of in the Chinese discourse, where maybe there is a greater separation between, I guess, the public speech, maybe the media elsewhere, and then the learned interpretation, the academic, academic discourse, academic disquisitions on what constitutes certain ideas, certain notions. And of course, then we have to mention Hu Jintao, who has been a successor of Jiang Zemin, and who has also been offering his own sense of what the course of China's development will be during his time in office, and how he has been affecting the governance in China. And I think that in this respect, the perspective of Kevin Rudd is very instructive, since he was in the past the acting prime minister, and before that, and even after, member of various think tank governance frameworks in Australia, and he has had a relatively close perspective on what has been going on in China, since Australia has been gaining enormously from the economic rise of China, such as by selling raw materials to China, such as by having that cushion to its economic performance, so that when the world elsewhere in the West has been suffering from economic ups and downs elsewhere, Australia has been relatively unaffected due to its strong exporting interrelationship with China, which has allowed Australia to weather very well the previous economic crisis, and then which has maybe also made it dependent on the resource economy, resource exports. And I think it could also be affecting Kevin Rudd's perspective on China, which could be on the one hand a sense that it is something happening across the pond, and basically in the near broad for Australia, so to say, and that also may be affecting Australia's reflection on the international affairs, international policy and politics, and the military strategy of the West and for the region itself. Both for the West in general and for Australia in particular, since I think that for Kevin Rudd, the primary audience for this book is actually his home country, other than English speakers internationally. So that, and I think this gives Kevin Rudd sufficient background to zero in on Xi Jinping's ideological worldview and on the renewed stress Xi has been putting on ideology in the recent years. And also how important such notions and theories as dialogical, dialectical materialism can be, or historical materialism can be. Basically, we underestimate, I understand, the importance of the intellectual tradition of Marxism for the present-day Chinese intellectual and policy and political discourse, and I think this is some of the I believe gaps that these books very validly fills. And of course, the party congresses. In other words, I think that once again, maybe in the French press, there has been a lot of attention to each party congress in China, since it is usually something important for the course China is charting internationally in the politics, in its economic affairs, etc. And I think that in the West there has been relatively less attention being paid, maybe as opposed to Europe, maybe as opposed to other countries around China. And once again, we have to reflect on what the championing by China and Xi in particular of Marxism means for its international standing, so that this is in other words, an important book in that respect, since it takes this topic and delves into that and thinks, okay, how that is important, anything it is, there is no doubt about that. So, and this also has importance for the ideology of China, the changes of that in recent years, in recent essentially decades, and especially under Xi Jinping, and how it affects the domestic and international politics of China and policy. And I think this has also been happening on the background of the increasing centralization of power in China, and there have been many vocal criticisms of that. At the same time, there is a place for maybe a neutral ground examination of what that means, specifically what the implications of that is, and how that means, how that affects the role that the Communist Party plays in China in terms of other state institutions, in terms of policy leadership, and in terms of the political control of the institutions via the instruments that Communist Party has for enforcing probably anti-corruption measures, for enforcing other measures in the wider society, and also maybe internationally in terms of the policy blueprints, white papers it writes. And also, of course, we cannot really leave out of view the confrontation between China and the West, and especially we can think of maybe 2016, 2020, when Donald Trump has had his presidency, and maybe this year onwards, 4 more years, when Trump resumes a position of the President of the United States, and how that has been affecting and also will be affecting the security policy of China, as it has to deal with high tariffs, as it has to deal with higher levels of basically policy hostility towards China in the United States, and maybe also in the West as well. So that this is part of what this book deals with in its own right. And of course, this book explores what the stronger role of the Communist Party leadership in China means for this country, internally and externally, in this context. And of course, the continued importance and maybe resurgence of Marxist Leninism in China is something that maybe is not taken seriously or not fully understood. And I think this book goes into detail on that, what that means, how that happens, and what should the lessons from that be. Especially for the economic policy. In other words, I think that for the external countries, one of the more important applications of all that is how that will be affecting the economic policy of China, its policies in terms of the international competition for supremacy economically and technologically, and in terms of how other countries are going to be able to cope with that. And basically one can speak in this context not only about political ideology but also economic ideology, and I think this is something that one needs to understand in terms of the development of socialism in China, whatever the contradictions of that may be, or whatever the pitfalls of that have been historically and can be in the present day as well. Such as in terms of economic development, maybe the legacy of the one-child policy, the aging of the population, maybe also the effective slowing down of the rate of the economic growth in China, and how that will be affecting in terms of let's say AI, robot deployment, automation in China, and also the West more generally. And of course, the more recent decade is actually exemplary of that, as China has been applying, I guess, some of the necessary reforms in the path of its own economic evolution, as an export-driven economy, as a country which probably undervalues its currency and seeks to conquer markets internationally. And I think that the really record surpluses in terms of international trade China has been gaining in recent years are an illustration of that. In other words, we cannot really discount the effect of those policies on the effective economic success of China, one way or another, and what were the intellectual developments centered on Xi Jinping's discourse, centered on Xi Jinping's ideological evolution in the last decade, so that this is something happening almost in real time, in the last decade. And I think this book pauses and looks back and says, okay, let's do a reconsideration of that period and the place of ideology in all that picture, and especially for the industrial policy, as it is very likely to be different from that of the West in similar conditions. Had it been in other words, we underestimate that Chinese policymaking is fundamentally different from the Western policymaking, and in this respect, this book pays attention to that, which is highly important, especially in the manufacturing sector, in which essentially China has any monopoly position internationally. How that connects to the economic modernization of China, how that will be affecting foreign markets, other countries, and what place state-owned enterprises have in the whole process, which is also very important, and how the private sector is actually interlinked with the state-led sector, which we also don't necessarily appreciate in the West. In terms of both coverage in the media and in the scholarly discourse, and what does that mean to the relations of China in terms of exports, economic relations, social relations, etc. It all needs to be explored, and this book does exactly that. And of course, the key issue in this book is the nationalism. The resurgent nationalism in China, the emphasis on the rejuvenation of Chinese nation in its official discourse, the cultural nationalism, which is also something that is not necessarily covered enough, and this book covers that, which is important. And also, how does China maybe rethinks its own historical record, how China rethinks its own traditional cultural legacy from past centuries, past millennia. And I think this is something that has been used also to construct the modern day nationalism in China, how China understands its cultural identity, national identity, and how this nationalism has also been sold abroad or represented abroad. Is also important to understand maybe the gaps between the internal discourse and external discourse. And I think this is also something that has been affecting Chinese foreign policy. The assertiveness of China on the global stage, on the global scale, which has been following on the period where China has been intentionally downplaying its power, has been intentionally essentially playing hide and seek with its economic rise over the decades, while trying to gain advantages on the international stage. And I think especially neighboring countries of China have been affected a lot by that, and especially as China rises more, obviously there are a lot of implications for the neighboring countries and also internationally, as it affects also global affairs, global economy. As China rethinks itself as a great power, especially in the confrontation with the United States, which is a topic in its own right. And of course, how China's rise is affecting, or already has been affecting the global order. Especially as it has been historically dominated by the United States in recent decades. In maybe in the last century or so, so that this is something that we don't necessarily understand enough. And I think this book does a lot in terms of clarifying that. And especially this book also goes into detail on the role China has been playing in the United Nations institutions, in the position Beijing has been taking on human rights across various bodies internationally, and how China has been expressing a position on peacekeeping, on the security issues internationally, what the moves in the United Nations have been by China overall over the last decades, and more particularly during the Xi Jinping's reign, essentially, or more properly, service as the chairperson of the Chinese Communist Party. And how does that affect the international norms? How the discourse around that has also been essentially changing under the essentially under the impact of the officially Marxist country, which is essentially China. And so this is something that we need to reappraise. In other words, how the evolution of Chinese thought, Chinese ideological thought, has been happening over the last 3/4 of a century after the communist regime has been established in the modern China in the last century, and how has that been re-evaluated in this century, such as thought of Mao, such as the examination by the contemporary China of its historical record in the communist period, and I think we underestimate how much of vibrancy there is in the Chinese historical discourse, how much thinking is actually happening in Chinese academia, in Chinese policy circles about both distant China's past and about the modern time Chinese history, so that this book pays enough attention to that, apparently. And of course, in the West, there is an apprehension that Xi Jinping can be building his own cult of personality, and that it could be echoing the period of Mao Zedong in Chinese history, and of course how that affects the official Chinese party, the Chinese Communist Party's presentation of history, periodization, official thought, and official communication, internally and externally. And I think that as we enter further stage of development of Chinese economy and society and culture, and as we see the continued importance of ideology in China, and how that affects policy and politics, economics, national identity, in the internal affairs and foreign affairs, security policy, technological affairs, and that becomes fairly complex, so that a book level inquiry into all those aspects of the interrelations is very important in its own right. And once again, this book does keep a very strong focus on the role of ideology in China, and what essentially sees Xi Jinping's role in that is, and how that has been also driving strategic policy changes in China, how that has been charting the course for the development of China in terms of political ideas, in terms of the economic development and policy in place, in terms of responses to challenges of the economic development, which are very likely to be very different from those in the West. and of course how the Chinese development overall has been impacted by the ideological ideas, etc. And I think that as we are entering a further stage, maybe a slow down stage of China's economic development, the importance of ideology is likely to be paramount, especially given the structure of the country, given the power structures of the country, and of course these trends will be affecting both the internal affairs and external affairs of China, basically, especially by formulating the tenets of China's foreign policy in the present moment. In other words, so that it is important to understand how this ideology has formed. At the same time, it is as important to understand how that ideological apparatus is going to be affecting what is actually to come, especially as the confrontation of China and the West is going to continue in the coming years and decades, very likely. So that essentially for China, one cannot really discount the impact of Marxism, Maoism, even Leninism until the present day, and it really contrasts very strongly with the expectation in the West that essentially economic development in itself is enough to drive China on the path toward a convergence with the West, economically, culturally, socially, etc. Maybe the notion of globalization has been well exemplary of that false opinion, which was very widely adopted in the West, that essentially there is a point at which China will become more and more like the other Western countries, as it actually copies their policies. But in this book, essentially argues that it is not the case, that essentially we cannot underestimate the importance of ideological luggage that China has been carrying throughout the last century, and that this will be something that Western leaders, Western policymakers and observers of China are going to also be paying attention through the very force of the events, through the very difference China is going to demonstrate to other countries in general, to the West in particular, in terms of its policy measures, in terms of the language it uses, in terms of its own cultural development, which is likely to be fairly unique, fairly specific to China, and in contrast to whatever is going on elsewhere in the nearby countries, in nearby Asian sphere, and then also globally.